For most of us on the Gulf Coast, the worst case scenario in life is being forced to leave our home. Whether due to coastal erosion, repetitive flooding, or another disaster, having to relocate our homes due to climate change is on most of our lists of worst nightmares. On the program, we've talked about climate change and migration multiple times, but a new report from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine shines a spotlight on what's often termed managed retreat. But by focusing on the history of migration and adaptive strategies, the report's authors highlight the importance of community-driven solutions and argue that community relocation can be thoughtful, planned, and more equitable than we might imagine. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in and associate director of Rice University's Center for Environmental Studies, and the associate director of Eco Studio in Rice's Sustainability Institute. And you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Today, we're talking all about community-driven relocation with the authors of a new report from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. So I am joined by John Ben Swallow, who is the program officer with the Board of Environmental Change and Society, and Grace Betts, who is the associate program officer, along with Janice Barnes, who is managing partner adaptation at Adaptation Partners, who all have been working on this report that's recently come out and thinking together. And so thank you so much for joining us and joining in this conversation.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for creating the room for these conversations to happen.
So just to start us off, I'm hoping you can introduce yourselves a little bit and this report that you've assembled, and just tell us a little bit about, both what got you started thinking in on this and made the National Academies want to really do a deep dive into the subject, but also, how that team formed, because I know you all have really distinct and different backgrounds, and the team was more extensive than just the people on this call as well. So I'd love to hear a little bit just about that process.
Sure, I can start us off. I was the director for this effort, so there's a couple of things to say. A lot of our work at the National Academies, for the most part, is funded by external clients. So a lot of our work comes from federal agencies or foundations, philanthropic agencies. But this one actually came from within the National Academies. So we have a division called the Gulf Research Program. The Gulf Research Program was started by the criminal lawsuit funds from the Deepwater Horizon disaster. So the Department of Justice approached the National Academies with $500 million from those funds and asked them to start a program with a number of strategies and objectives, one of those being to enhance the Gulf, the health and resiliency of Gulf Coast communities. And so that particular unit within the Gulf Research Program, which we call the GRP, approached our board, which sits in a different division, which is the Social Science Division and Education Division of the National Academies, approached our Board of Environmental Change and Society, BECS, and asked us to stand up a committee to oversee and co-author a report about managed retreat in the Gulf Coast region. So I can get into a little bit of the transition from the term managed retreat to community-driven relocation as we get there. But a part of that process is we have permanent staff here at the National Academies. Grace Betts, Associate Program Officer, Program Officer, and we have Board Director, and we have others that help us out. We have a pretty small team. But we looked at the Statement of Task, which was the study charge, basically, that was developed between the sponsor, the Gulf Research Program, and our board, Environmental Change and Society. And the Gulf Research Program really tossed it up to us because to get some objectivity on it, but also to really center it on the human dimensions of climate adaptation and thinking about relocation, as a human-centered adaptation strategy. So hence the social science perspective that we could bring. Nonetheless, however, the committee we stood up, because of the complexity of issues of relocation, crosses all of the scientific domains. So we have expertise from architecture and planning, environmental policy, environmental sciences, the humanities and social sciences, of course, and also from sort of the health sciences. So we had a very multidisciplinary committee of 13 people, co-chaired by Janice Barnes, who is with us today, and the other co-chair who could make it is Tracy Simpier. She works with the Mississippi-Alabama Sea Grant Consortium down in Gulfport. So that's a little bit about the process of building it up.
And so, yeah, I mean, I'm curious both, I do want to hear about that transition from managed retreat to community-driven relocation. But also, I mean, maybe just starting with a definition, I think folks are familiar with the idea, climate is changing. Yes, our environment around us is changing. There's various factors going on. But, I wanted to start with honoring, like, it is really hard and really challenging for people to imagine having to leave their homes. And that's really difficult and it's scary. And I think, particularly on the Gulf Coast, that's something that we think about a lot. It's clearly from you discussing your team, a good number of folks have connections directly to the Gulf Coast and are very aware of that. But I mean, just starting with this idea of, this is a really hard thing for people to wrap their heads around, that, the world is changing and we may have to actually relocate, sometimes not particularly far, sometimes somewhat further. But, that's a difficult thing for people to process. And so I'm wondering, if you can start us there with both this idea and especially, I mean, you mentioned it as a strategy and a kind of, resiliency strategy, but also thinking really specifically about, for folks who are scared by this, not jumping straight into the kind of end of, what are your recommendations, but, how can we wrap our heads around a little bit something that I think people deservedly find really frightening and heartbreaking?
Oh, I was gonna say, I think like the way that I view this, I mean, I could say things about the terminology, which I think a lot of what we learned about that was from directly like talking to communities and also like community organizations who have resources out, like the Climate Migration Network. They have this whole guide on leading with listening, and they talked about the connotations of managed retreat. But yeah, the way I view community-driven relocation in this is like as one of many possible adaptation strategies. And like, I think I see this report and like the recommendations that are made as a way to make relocation a possible option for like those communities that decide to pursue it, rather than it being like something that people have to do.
Mm. And so to go back, thank you. That is helpful and already I think frames us in a slightly less terrifying light. But I think that's really significant too that you mentioned actually that terminology change, which when I first seen this report, my immediate jump was to, we're talking about managed retreat, which I think is kind of the colloquial term that maybe it's a little insidery, but that idea of we're going to have to move, so it's managed retreat. I am really intrigued by the idea that community members got you to community-driven relocation. And I wonder if you can tell us just a little bit about that process of, and sometimes it seems like, the language on these things is the least important, but actually it really matters because it speaks to intentionality in a way that I think is important. And so I'm wondering if you can walk us through a little bit of why that change came and some of that work you did with community to find out that's more the kind of vocabulary and thought process they have going on.
Yeah, I can start us off for that. I mean, frankly, Americans and a lot of other people don't like to be managed and they don't like to retreat. But terminology is important. And a lot of people understand that term as a very top-down way of approaching the relocation process. But it goes beyond that. What we heard is that it really indexes a lot of historical trauma of forced displacements that happened in the region, such as the Indian Removal Act and others. And some of the other reasons is that for the committee, calling it that really centers community in that process and at the decision-making table about the many processes involved in a relocation strategy. We also wanted to align with some of the nascent federal efforts happening around relocation. So right now there is a community-driven relocation subcommittee that is co-chaired by FEMA and the Department of the Interior and includes 12 or 13 other agencies. as well as a national resilience framework that came out of the White House last fall that uses this term as well and also aligns with a lot of the recommendations in the report. And so we, as Grace mentioned, we really hope to normalize this idea of relocation as a viable option, at least to put it on the table and try and sort of insert it into the lexicon of adaptation strategies. But I'll welcome Janice or Grace and for any other notes.
The only other thing I would say, and I love the way you characterized that, John Ben, the only other thing I would say to complement is the choice of how you want to manage your household's risk should sit with you. And the work that needs to be done is the kind of democratization of data and awareness building and understanding whether or not households have choice. Because sometimes you could be fully aware of those risks and still not have a choice to relocate. And some of our workshop participants were quite clear about having to make those very tough decisions to stay because relocation would require losing some critical supports, even as risk reduction was underway. So I think making sure that we're really clear when you think about equity and the importance of not just being invited to participate, but having a meaningful and sustained seat at the table when it comes to these questions, we have to create a context where households have choice. And whether it's a single household or a group of households, that's to be determined. That's not a presumption to make at every turn. But if we're not creating the context where you can make decisions because you're fully aware of what your options are and what your risks are in your community, then the subsequent steps that need to be made, like, well, where would you go? You're also not fully aware of potential risk in those areas too, right? Or the readiness of those other places to support you. So community-driven is bidirectional as well. It's originating as well as receiving communities. So how is the receiving community set up to support incoming new community members, and how is the originating community going to evolve as households decide to make the choice to leave or stay?
That's really critical. And I so admire, and we're going to get to more about the kind of originating community and receiving community in a bit, I think. But, I'm glad that you use this phrase democratization of data and this idea of really trying to make people, not only aware of what's going on, but also giving them the access to the tools that they can make decisions for themselves, they can understand what those risks are. I think that's been something that, in the last few years has gotten a lot better, but is still something that I think folks are really working hard at to try to make folks able to see what these risks are. And that kind of dovetails perfectly, because what I was going to bring up is, I think a lot of people, increasingly, especially over the last year or two, I think for many of us, it feels kind of like climate change has landed. We've gone through a couple of really miserably hot summers, and people are starting to move from the kind of, climate change is far off in the future. And folks increasingly, I think, are feeling like, oh, it's here now. And I think this issue of people are going to have to move is something that we're starting to see the beginnings of. We've talked multiple times in the past on the show about climate refugees and this kind of idea of the climate refugee. We don't necessarily think of that as internally, but displacement is already happening. And as your report goes through, there are already examples of where people are having to relocate. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about a few of those examples of where we're already seeing people move, what the drivers are that are forcing them, or that they've decided this is the right call for our community. And, we're seeing this in real time now. Can you walk us through a little bit of some of those existing examples?
There are existing examples where things have worked out really well. There's a great example up in Indiana. FEMA actually has a podcast too. So they interviewed the mayor and talked about what it actually took in that community to make that change happen, and how it's turned out years later from relocation in a floodplain, not at coastal, but at a floodplain. And if you go up to P-Town, up to Provincetown, there are houses that have these little plaques on the wall, outside wall, and it actually shows little houses floating on logs.
Oh,
And
wow.
the houses that used to be out on what was the barrier island, at least the way I understand it, that have been relocated, have those plaques. So there's this history, and I think Provincetown's a pretty successful relocation story, but there's a history, or there's a knowledge there. And when we talk to community leaders in Louisiana, they talked about, Jonathan Foray talked about the history of migrating up the bayou as something that happens generationally, something that's well understood. And you can go back to native populations in the region who move with resource changes. Or you could go to South Carolina coast and listen to the Gullah Geechee talk about living with water in a different way. So there's a lot of expertise that's in place, not only contemporary examples, but also historic examples that we can draw on and celebrate, because there's knowledge about how to there.
But yeah, there's also there's like the New Jersey Blue Acres program, which I think is a really important one to highlight. They've done a lot of work on like kind of trying to fill in the gaps, I would say, of like where there's federal government support is like kind of hard to find and access for communities. And that's a state level program. And they do things, I want to say, like help communities who are at flood risk to like apply for pre-funding so that like if they experience a disaster, they can be ready to move. I know if Gavin was on this call, he'd probably talk a lot about the work that's done in North Carolina. I think following Hurricane Matthew, we have an example in the report about like, I want to say 600 homes that either were eligible to relocate or relocated following Hurricane Matthew. And I think one of the things that they did there was not use the benefit cost analysis that usually is required, which can sometimes be a barrier and like slow down the process of moving. And that was sort of I think a win in that regard. But yeah, just throwing details out.
No, I mean, that's helpful. And it's helpful to think through, both the kind of contemporaneous examples that you're mentioning that seem quite global, and thinking about looking at those for strategies and different ways of understanding, but also those historic ones. And you were talking about moving up the bayou. I was actually thinking of the Karankawa tribe that's, local here to Houston, which would migrate between Galveston Island and the Houston area throughout the year, depending on hurricane season, and really knowing where that safest place was. And this idea of flexibility we really struggle with a lot of times today, but it's something that's really ingrained historically amongst a lot of cultures, and trying to imagine ways to kind of build in that flexibility, I think is an interesting way to rethink the way that we're engaging with, our lived environments.
Yeah, I just wanted to add too that starting off the conversation, it seems like such a radical adaptation strategy, relocation, right? But I think as Grace and Janice mentioned, we've been doing this for over 100 years. And in our report, we cover cases from the Midwest that go back to the late 1800s, and and then all the way up into sort of the sort of FEMA era and the post 2000s. We have very successful cases internationally. Fiji is one of them. Also, Grantham, Australia is a very well-documented, successful case that was very community-led. And we also have from the tsunami, so in Tohoku, Japan, there was a large movement away from the coast. But one of the things about the Fiji case that I think really that we used, at least in the engagement and communication chapter, is that they have it's called like a standard operating procedures or something, but it's a guideline for planned relocation, but it's a living document. So it gets updated continuously as relocations happen. And so that sort of thing is such a useful tool. And thinking about how long we've been doing this, yet how young the idea seems, something like that. There's all of these lessons to be learned from around the world and even within the country.
Well, I want to go into something that Grace had hinted at a little bit ago, because I think it's a good segue, actually, is, you had brought up this idea of originating and receiving communities, which, especially as we start thinking exactly of these different ways that people have coped with moving, how you integrate new populations, how, moving populations can hold on to pieces of home from where they are, it becomes really, really critical. And so I'm wondering if you could, originating communities being these ones I understand that are, going somewhere else, right? And the receiving community being the community that is taking in these folks. Am I understanding these terms correctly?
Yeah, that's right.
Sometimes we used relocating like for this sort of intermediate, but yeah, originating and receiving.
And so, yeah, I'm just wondering if you can walk us through, some of the factors that make a receiving community, ready for the originating community, but also, ways that you're articulating or seeing, strategies for these two to come together, and what makes for these successful comminglings of populations as people are relocating.
I can start just because the receiving communities part was probably my favorite of the report. I think it's like kind of a often for overlooked piece of this. And we talked, I remember something about like sort of this idea of cousin cities, sort of similar to sister cities idea, where like a community that is an originating community that might be regularly impacted by hurricanes or sea level rise, and then like a nearby town that has in the past maybe been receiving people who move from there, and like connecting those cities so that they can plan sort of together about like, we can become a place where we can receive people who are relocating from your community. And also ideally that would be broader. So I think like setting up those networks for not only just like originating, receiving communities to talk to each other, but also originating and receiving. There's also a lot about like funding that needs to go to receiving communities so that they can prepare. I know we talked about sort of the capacity and many different facets of that capacity. I know Janice worked on that part of the report for sure. So I don't know if you want to jump in.
So it's a question. I don't know, Weston, if you have kids or you're taking care of seniors in your household, but imagine you need to relocate and the school's beyond capacity. Where are you going to send your kids?
Yeah.
Or the senior center the elder care center doesn't have room. So there are the infrastructure questions to consider in some receiving communities. And one of our committee members, Deborah Butler, had done some of her doctoral coursework trying to understand the kind of next level in neighborhoods and recognize that oftentimes, and we see this in lots of coastal communities where there's a lot of money on the coast and not always a lot of money right inland, like that may be where a lot of the community members who work to support that money on the coast live. The resource burden can be quite significant if you're not thinking about that. So what is truly the carrying capacity, not just of the natural systems, but also of the infrastructure writ broad? So the schools, the healthcare, the jobs, the larger sets of economy issues, not only the water, the storm sewer, the sanitary sewer, the grocers and their availability, the transportation routes, etc. So if you were to imagine taking one of Houston's super neighborhoods and relocating it into another one, what would that actually mean to the one who receives, right? And if we're thinking about that in terms of these communities, we really have to understand what the needs are going to be, what the capacities already are, and what kinds of preparatory practices need to be put in place to get those receiving communities not only ready to receive additional community members, but also to help shore them up, right? Like designing the places we want to live. So these are opportunities to really rethink the way investments are being planned. I think in Houston, you have an example of a buy-in strategy that the city's been talking about for a bit. I don't know how far along that's gotten, but there's an adjacency criterion as well as this carrying capacity criterion. So if you think about all the systems that support your family, like this is where my doctor, my dentist, my this and that actually are, the farther away from those that you get, the less likely that you can continue to sustain those relationships. So there's another question that says, is there an opportunity nearby to buy in or improve the higher ground so that you don't have to break all those loose ties? And if you really have to break those ties, are you putting the infrastructure, again, using the term very broadly, in place to support And that's where the reference to Gavin's work on land suitability analysis is critical, because we're seeing in the literature lots of times people might be relocating, but relocating to equally or potentially even more risky areas, because that's what you can afford sometimes with the buyout money that you receive. And given the cost of housing escalation in the kind of post-COVID, it's the other hockey stick, right? The cost of housing that's gone up in that time period. We really have to reassess whether or not the mechanisms are in place to allow people to move to less risky areas. Like, are you aware of democratization of data? Can you afford to, and are the supports in place for?
No, that's so critical, and thank you for the kind of Houston comparison there. It's bringing me back to a conversation we had a few months ago on the program with 3 sociologists, including Jim Elliott, who's put out a lot of research around where folks move when they move, and has found that people move an average of something like 6 miles. So it's often not that far. And one of the things that really stuck with me in that conversation was a discussion around a popular neighborhood in the city, Meyerland, and how people didn't want to move out of Meyerland entirely because of school district requirements. And the neighborhood flooded badly, but and one of the panelists kind of raised the possibility of, if you had just grandfathered people into their school district, right, when they move somewhere else, where would they have gone? What would that have looked like in terms of reducing that repeat flood risk? And I mean, that's a kind of prompt that, as you're talking about those loose ties that are so critical, especially in times of catastrophe, chaos, disaster. We need those so desperately. Yeah, I mean, any way we can maintain those seems really critical. Yeah, Grace.
I just wanted to add a little bit about the land suitability analysis. I think just another way that, with trying to keep people within a jurisdiction or a community, another way that like cities can go about planning for it is working the land suitability analysis findings into development plans or land use plans and things that the city is relying on to make plans as to like density of development in certain areas versus others. And that has been something that I think like a little bit more recently has been applied in some cities. I think places in Florida, possibly Texas, have been trying to do that sort of thing. So just like actually putting it into the city plans.
Yeah, last thing I'll say about land suitability analysis is that it is one opportunity for some capacity building. Because if you're taking a community-centered approach, you're including people in the decision-making, you're including people and really utilizing and sharing knowledge from a variety of participants, right? From government agencies, from the private sector, and from the communities themselves who have a wealth of knowledge about the land they live on. So thinking about that and ways to involve people meaningfully, but also providing opportunities for learning. And so, and this goes both ways, right? So a lot of technical assistants can learn from local knowledge and then a lot of technical assistants can train people on how to do land suitability analysis that other technical assistants will understand. So there's a couple of two-way streets here that really do provide an opportunity for capacity building within this space. And the report with that community-driven focus really tries to acknowledge these opportunities.
And that's kind of perfect. I mean, one of the things that you point out in the report is that often especially in times of crisis, communities don't wind up having a voice in the process. That, as people are starting to move around, as change is happening, either intentionally or unintentionally, groups are getting left out of that conversation. Can you talk a little about some of those challenges of getting affected communities' voices heard, and some of the ways that, we can really learn lessons about making sure that as people are going through these immensely stressful circumstances, that they're getting a voice in the process?
I can start real quick by saying that trust and relationships are really at the heart of all of this. And so, and this, just to answer a question that you brought up earlier, Weston, so there's a little bit of a parallel story going on here. So as a national organization, the National Academies generally builds relationships with quote unquote stakeholders who represent sectors who have the time and capacity to volunteer, right, to come to our workshops. In this case, the committee felt that to really learn about people on the front lines, we needed to hear those voices. Yet, these people have very busy lives. They have children, they have jobs, subsistence, and commercial activities. that it would pull them away from. And so compensation was a really important aspect to this. And it's not something the academies generally does. So we were like, how are we going to hear from these people, right? And like they're busy. What can we do? And so we found a little bit of a workaround. So we found locally trusted community-based organizations that were within our committee's networks. Some of them were out, some of them were suggestions through our work that we were recommended to, and we hired them as consultants. And in their contract, we stipulated that they need to identify, recruit, and compensate, and then bring to the workshops people on the front lines that are facing these issues and these decisions. So it really helped us lean on existing trusting relationships. And I think that's a huge part of putting people at the center of it. And one of the challenges is that community-based organizations, faith-based institutions, local NGOs, and community leaders really need to be the sort of message carriers in a lot of ways, because they're the people that local people trust. And so bringing them into the conversation and really expanding the conversation to the trusted parts of the community is one way to overcome that sort of assumptions about top-down processes, these sorts of things, and really make sure that everyone has a role in the process.
No, that's great. Thank you. I mean, that's really clear, and I think that's actually a really important model to highlight on the ways that folks can understand how to reach out to these community members and that importance. So I wanted to ask something about, I think longtime listeners of the program may know this about me, but my first time living in Texas was post Katrina. I'm originally from New Orleans and came out here for a few months in the wake of that. So this is something that is both familiar and a little, eerily mimics parts of my own life. I opened with this a little bit, and I want to revisit it, but it's really, really hard, right? when you're needing to move somewhere else, when things have changed, to maintain that connection to place, to hold on to, and people want it, people crave that, I miss my home, I miss these things. And some of those are certainly those community ties, but some of it's just about cultural heritage. And so I'm wondering if, in the wonderful work that you've done and in this research and the history in particular, you found strategies or identified ways that really allow for migratory communities to maintain that connection to heritage and place in ways that make that transition to somewhere new a little less jarring. Or is that the impossible scenario we've listed out here?
I'll just quickly, before I pass it on to someone else, reference that this sort of generational up the bayou is, not necessarily a model. I guess it's something that happens quite naturally with eroding coastlines and, impending storms and the acceleration of climate change. But, that is a one way to kind of connect the dots from origins to other places. I will also say, and I don't want to butcher this, but there's a very emblematic but also controversial example of large-scale community relocation called the Isle de Jean Charles Resettlement Project, which happened in Southeast Louisiana. And those were indigenous communities, and they were very concerned about having access rights to their original homes along the coast where they were leaving. And under federal agency policies that do this, HUD, FEMA, once the land is vacated, it can't be used again. It definitely can't be used for residential purposes. So there's a lot of pushback. Again, this is a very kind of high-level summary of this, by these indigenous groups and by locals that they actually changed policy. And this was with the help of a lot of local help, local other stakeholders, and institutions, organizations involved to make sure that for a certain number of years, at least, people that did accept the relocation offer and the plans could access commemorative places for commemoration and other sorts of reasons, even access to resources. And so, thinking about the current state of policy and some of the restrictions that it imposes on place attachment, I think is an important part of the discussion.
I am also probably not going to do this example justice, but I think it was Louisiana, and somebody jump in if they remember, but there was an example of a group that had found sort of like an area that they liked and that they felt sort of connected to, and that they were sort of trying to like build it out as a place where they could move and like grow and like more people from their community could move to. But I'm not, John Ben, do you remember what I'm talking about, or Janice?
Yeah, actually, I think it was Beth Butler's group, Community
Oh
Voice,
yeah.
down in New Orleans. And so the way that I remember that playing out is that every time people decided to evacuate, they started to go to the same place. And over time of staying at that same place, for whatever reason, over time, they found a place that resembled what they were used to back home, right? So I think this might have been a sort of nearby bayou that runs through the back of the community, something like that. And so over time, they were able to sort of familiarize themselves and build a relationship with this place so that, one day that if the time comes, they would have a place that felt more like home that they could potentially go to.
Well, and that kind of segues into a broader, you put together this report, it's 300 pages for folks who haven't leafed through the whole thing, which I will admit it's an ambitious report is my point. But you pull together a lot of conclusions and a lot of suggestions on things. And so I'd literally love to move into what are some of the best practices, what recommendations, especially as we think towards this is going to continue happening, probably escalating and becoming more common. Probably if folks are familiar with any of the policies that exist, it's maybe buyouts or the kind of one they've heard about in some way. But I'm curious about, what are the implications of some of the things we're already doing? What are best practices for going forward? And are there particular things you'd like to highlight as really important strategic recommendations around how we should be thinking around relocation going forward?
Maybe I can jump on that one. There's the first recommendation is about well-being. Well-being doesn't always float to the top when we're talking about buyouts or federal processes or even local planning. So by changing the dynamic to the point of transdisciplinary practice, by changing the dynamic to say that public health and sustained community well-being should be at the absolute center of all the decision-making that needs to happen, it not only changes the agency and the actors, but it also brings in voices that might typically not be included in, say, a planning program or a relocation project. So for the ones that you've touched, for example, just reflect and say, how many public health representatives were part of that planning? Do we actually understand the existing mental health and the level of stressors that are coming from the chronic exposure, in this case, to floodwaters? Do we understand what that stress level is already introducing to the community and the kind of support that households, individuals, or the larger community will need to not only manage the stress they're under, but to kind of resettle and have a much more healthful, forward-focused future? When we think about that, we bring in folks like Lynn or Gary Belkin who have deep expertise in mental health and well-being. And when you look at RFPs that are out for consultancies to help with these planning projects that are happening all over the country, all over the world right now, for the most part, the ones that I've seen have nothing about public health in them. So that is a groundswell shift, in my opinion, to say we want to center the well-being of households and communities in the decision-making process and in the investments that need to be made. So you're not trading house for house or street for street, but you're instead saying, how do we design the life we want to reduce these kinds of chronic stresses? There's a pediatrician not that long ago speaking at a Florida physicians conference, and she said, we now have data that show there are children who start crying when it rains really hard because they know their house is going to flood. And these data are just emerging. The literature on pediatric mental health tied to climate change is very much emerging. So that recommendation, to me, it's recommendation number one. It's at the center of this work. And the second set of recommendations are about local collaborations, the issues that John Ben and Grace have just been sharing. What does it actually take to have this kind of sustained, local, trustful, trust building, capacity building set of relationships, the kinds of zesty relational practices that encourage everyone to stay involved over time The last set of recommendations have a lot to do, and I think there are federal agencies mentioned in all but maybe one of these recommendations. The last set's really kind of the preparatory work. But those first two, it's a mindset shift. It's a mindset shift about who is at the table and what role they need to play in order for this to have a chance to be successful.
Yeah, and I can just give you a couple examples of like some of the planning related recommendations. So one of them is to modify federal grant programs so that programming of open space is a part of that, like can be included in that funding. And I think that's important to like the community cultural aspect of things too, because one of the people we spoke to, I want to say it was in Texas, like did take a buyout and she relocated and then she went back and saw her house and it was basically just like a vacant lot in a neighborhood and like trash was accumulating and like I don't think that makes people feel good about the chance to relocate. So I think that's important, not just for like land use. And then the other example is that federal and other relocation funding guidelines include a requirement that households relocate to a place that's outside of special flood hazard areas. So just like ensuring that people are actually, when they do decide to relocate, are actually going somewhere that will be more safe to this, at least flooding, although there's many other factors that people need to pay attention to.
We promote in this report and in these efforts, community-driven relocation. But as Grace said, we don't promote relocation as the only adaptive strategy. There's a lot of diehard protect in place people, and we like respect them and believe that those are adaptive strategies as well. So even though this report is about relocation, there's a lot of other strategies out there. I think that that the last set of recommendations is strengthening preparations, but I think it's a pretty easy win. And so that's why I wanted to share it. It builds off of existing systems. And that's the establishment of something that we call in the program hazard mitigation or climate adaptation navigators. So these are people that could provide technical assistance to help communities apply for and implement some sort of relocation strategy, whether that's through a collective buyout program, whether that's a one-off individual buyout, or whether it's sort of like a community decision. And I think it's sort of an easy one because there's a National SEGRA program that has extension agents that sort of provide that relationship between communities and other institutions. There's a multitude of programs from NOAA's Climate Adaptation Partners and their RISA centers, as well as FEMA's Community Direct Technical Assistance program. So there's an element in here, again, an opportunity for some capacity building and to establish a workforce by training locals to be these navigators, right? So it's an opportunity to, again, bring into the fold and extend the conversation among people that can provide a trusted voice.
Weston, I'd like to say just one more thing that we didn't say in the beginning, and that is that the committee worked very hard. We used the coastal flooding as an example, but the recommendations are agnostic by hazard. So these issues are pertinent in wildfire, urban interfaces, in places where freshwater supplies are limited, for inland stormwater flooding. So we just want to make sure that it's not seen as, if you're not in the Gulf Coast coastal region, this doesn't pertain to you. It does pertain, and the recommendations have been set up to be hazard agnostic.
No, I mean, I think that's one of the great strengths is absolutely you're thinking broadly, and it's definitely applicable to a variety of regions globally, in fact, and you certainly make that point by the global examples that are pulled in as well. So thank you for that. And so, I mean, I think this is really significant in terms of how we're thinking, both within migrational patterns within our own, cities and communities, but also especially to new places. And so this is really significant. I really want to thank you for your time today and for sharing your findings and all this research and work, and just walking us through a little bit more of this issue and some of the places that we can, be better prepared, and also how we're seeing this issue play out in real time. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity. And as always, thanks to John, Ben, and Grace, because they carried so much of this wrangling all the cats, and also in helping us to connect with different federal agencies to get the message out and to connect with folks like you. So thank you for that, John, Ben, and Grace.
Thank you, Janice, for co-chairing such an excellent committee and study. Thanks to you, Weston, for inviting us on. Really appreciate it.
Now we'll go to our researcher, Alex, who will tell you about another DIY way to make the world a little greener.
From what we wear to how we wash it, our clothes can have a significant impact on our carbon footprint. I'm Alex, one of Gulfstream's researchers, and today I'm going to be talking about some everyday fashion choices you can make to reduce your emissions. Not many people consider the environmental toll of something like what we wear. It feels irrelevant to the climate, yet when we think about the origins and life history of our clothes, it can become a lot more clear how our decisions affect the world around us. Let's talk about the life of our clothes, starting from the beginning. Let's say we're talking about a cotton clothing item. To grow the cotton that the clothing will ultimately be produced from, harmful pesticides and fertilizers are exposed into the environment. According to the National Wildlife Federation, the average amount of cotton used for a typical t-shirt requires 17 teaspoons of chemical fertilizers. That's just over a third of a cup for every t-shirt. Additionally, according to research by Furman University, the production of the same quantity of cotton can consume up to 256 gallons of water. Then, the cotton must be processed and dyed. According to the Fort Bend Women's Center, the production of a single shirt can use up to 700 gallons of water, which is over 3 times the annual consumption for the average American. In 2015, the global fashion industry consumed 21 million gallons of water, and in the following year contributed 8% of global emissions. On top of that, only 2 out of 45 of the top clothing companies have emissions regulations that are strict enough to meet the standards set by the Paris Agreement, an international treaty that addresses climate mitigation and adaptation. After the shirt is produced and shipped away, which also has its own transportation-related emissions, the new owner must wash it. According to the New York Times, the average American household does 300 loads of laundry per year. A study in the Journal of Integrative Environmental Science estimates that American laundry habits release 179 metric tons of CO2 into the atmosphere per year, accounting for about 6% of an average citizen's emissions. Now, after many moments together, you and your clothes will eventually part ways. According to Scientific American, the US discarded 21 billion pounds of clothing to our landfills in 2015. Many of these clothing items are made from synthetic fibers, which are difficult to break down or can be composed of chemicals that are harmful to the environment. Additionally, it's estimated that 40% of these discarded clothes were still in usable condition. So it's now evident that even the production of our clothes is closely tied to the environment. But this puts us in a really difficult situation. Legally, I have to wear clothes, and personally, I'd like to keep them clean. So, is there a way we can still lessen our emissions with this in mind? Well, we can start by thinking about where we buy our clothes from. As I mentioned earlier, only 2 out of 45 of the largest clothing retailers have implemented policies which align with the Paris Agreement. As such, a good first step is to look for clothes elsewhere, perhaps from a more sustainable producer or even from secondhand stores. At its core, buying secondhand clothing will remove your support of unsustainable production practices. All of the energy and resources which would have gone into producing a new clothing item can now be saved when you opt for clothes which already exist. Actually, the Nordic Council of Ministers found that clothing reuse and recycling habits in Nordic countries saved 425 million pounds of CO2 and 19 billion gallons of water. Another alternative to secondhand shopping can be found at clothing swaps. Although these events can be pretty rare to come by, clothing swaps are becoming more popular as clothing banks fueled by participants' donations. A really great benefit of clothing swaps comes not only for your pockets, since all the clothes are free, but also for our landfills, as they produce even less waste than thrift centers, particularly those which are overwhelmed with donations. The premise of these events goes as such. People bring in clothes that they no longer need, and in return can browse for clothes that other people have surrendered. Although events like these can be difficult to find, there are many sustainable organizations which will host community clothing swaps. For example, last spring, the Rice Eco Reps here at Rice University actually held a clothing swap on campus. Now, once you've bought your clothes, keep them for longer. Today's fast fashion industry has normalized habits of mass consumption fueled by quickly evolving microtrends. Part of the reason the fashion industry is so harmful to the environment is because we keep constantly producing and discarding clothing items as new trends rise and fall, severely reducing the longevity of each piece. It's important to consider all of the resources which went into producing your clothes before you throw them out too soon. According to the Waste and Water Resources Action Program, extending your clothing items' lives by 3 months can actually result in a 5 to 10% reduction in our individual carbon, water, and waste footprints. Finally, we can also adjust how we wash our clothes. One reason doing laundry consumes so much energy is because of its heat use. Although hot washes are beneficial from time to time, the American Cleaning Institute estimates that the average American household can reduce their emissions by 864 pounds of carbon per year just by washing 80% of their loads with cold water. Once you've washed your clothes, then choosing to line dry can also make a significant difference. Dryers can use anywhere from 5 to 10 times as much energy as your washer, so cutting out your dryer altogether can be a simple way to save a lot of energy. However, if you don't have the space or you're not quite ready to go all the way to the line, pun intended, you can at least try drying your clothes on high spin settings. This will let centrifugal force do the work and lessen the heat required to dry your clothes. Ultimately, the goal is to be more conscious about the behind the scenes of your fashion habits. Although buying and washing clothes seems of little relevance to our climate, it can actually have a significant impact. So the next time you're looking to change up your style, think before you wear. Thank you all for listening to this week's episode of Gulf Streams, and I hope you enjoyed.
Finally, our researcher Jessica will tell you how you can get involved here in Houston this week.
Hi, this is Jessica with an opportunity to get involved this week. If you live near the Galveston Bay or feel passionate about protecting and maintaining the Bay, look toward the Galveston Bay Foundation, whose main mission includes initiatives in education, habitat restoration, water protection, land conservation, and advocacy. Their water monitoring team collects data from the Bay and evaluates it for overall quality and other factors that they report on an online site, mapping each location from which samples are taken. And they create a swimming safety guide. Check out their At Home with the Bay virtual field trip series, a recorded series of lessons on their website with an activity guide for K-12 students to get involved. They even give Galveston Bay an annual report card, evaluating areas of health and needed improvement throughout the Bay and its various ecosystems. In addition, they are hosting a rain barrel workshop on July 7th from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. at the Galveston Bay Foundation headquarters. Galveston Bay Foundation staff will lead a workshop including a pickup of barrels and other supplies, and an opportunity to learn about the process of installing a rain barrel and to learn how it benefits the environment as well as the local water supply. To register, visit their website at galvbay.org and navigate to the events page. While reserving a rain barrel for the workshop requires a $40 fee to supply a recycled rain barrel and connection kit, the event itself is free for those of all ages to attend. The foundation also offers various opportunities for volunteers, working in individual or group settings, who feel strongly about environmental issues. One theme of volunteer work is gardening, aka fostering oysters, maintaining their populations and promoting the growth of young oysters who provide important filtering services for the Bay's water. Their website also includes numerous helpful resources for those who encountered pollution and/or injured wildlife and would like to report it to an official source.
If you have ideas or questions for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski, co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Research support provided by Jaden Bray-Boyce and Sienna Yen. Research support provided by Jessica Shu, Caroline Pollan, and Alex Little. Stay tuned for the R&R show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.